Hi everyone, I'm Judah Vitale, functional nutritionist, lifestyle coach, and heart math mentor. And today's video we're going to talk about long-term chronic stress and long-term elevated cortisol and all the ways, well, not all the ways because there are so many ways, but we're going to talk about a good number of ways that long-term elevated cortisol affects your physiology in a negative way. Now in the last video, I talked about the ABCs of adrenal imbalances, and I walked you through all of the different factors that can affect adrenal function and cause imbalance in your adrenal glands. And one of those is chronic stress. Now, when we experience chronic stress, and chronic stress is anything that you experience that's low grade, it's not life-threatening, but it's something that you experience day in and day out. It could be relationship difficulties, work issues, financial struggle, traffic jams on a regular basis, something that is chronic and daily that you have to go through each and every day, or at least the majority of your days, that causes you stress. And so that stress response is going to stimulate the release of a hormone called cortisol, and cortisol is going to rise and help you basically respond to or adapt to that stress or challenge. Now, if this is going on for long term, say months and months, maybe even years, and you're not doing anything to manage the stress or change the stress, you're not doing a stress reduction technique, you're not taking any kind of herbs that can help with relaxing the nervous system, calming the nervous system down, what will happen is that over time, that cortisol will stay elevated and begin to impact different areas of your physiology. Now, there isn't a system in the body that is immune to the negative effects of long-term elevated cortisol. Okay? It has disastrous effects the longer it goes on. Now, one thing that you'll see, that I have seen, and you may notice as well, is that long-term chronic stress can cause a response in the adrenal's ability to handle sugar. So a lot of times what will begin to happen is people will become insulin resistant from long-term elevated cortisol. And that insulin resistance can lead to obesity. And where we primarily see this is the spare tire syndrome. So people who start to get that abdominal fat, that kind of spare tire there, that's a sign usually of long-term elevated cortisol. And so long-term elevated cortisol can lead to insulin resistance, which can lead to obesity. And that insulin resistance and that obesity can eventually lead to prediabetes and diabetes. So anytime there is adrenal stress issues, there are going to be blood sugar issues as well. They're intimately related together. Another thing that happens with long-term elevated cortisol is that it suppresses the secretion of an immunoglobulin in the gut called secretory immunoglobulin A, affectionately known as SIGA. Now, SIGA's job is it's kind of like the glue that holds the intestinal lining together, okay? And it reduces the ability for the intestinal lining to get infection or viruses, parasites even. So when there's reduced secretory immunoglobulin A, that begins to affect the lining of the gut. And the lining of the gut can begin to thin, and this can eventually lead to gastric or duodenal ulcers, as well as something called leaky gut. And leaky gut is where you begin to get either a loosening of the tight junctions of the small intestinal cells. So our small intestinal cells have this tight junction, and that can weaken and open up, and that will begin to allow things to cross from the digestive tract into the bloodstream that shouldn't. Things like undigested proteins or fragments of bacteria. And what that's going to cause is your immune system to see that and respond by attacking it as a foreign invader. And every time the immune system engages like that, it's followed by an inflammatory response. And now what you can start to experience is chronic inflammation. Okay? This is also the precursor to autoimmune disorders. So many autoimmune disorders will stem from leaky gut. So that's one thing that can happen there. That's another thing. Suppressed immune function can be caused by long-term elevated cortisol. So as cortisol levels stay high and adrenal function begins to lag, that begins to suppress immune function. So maybe what you notice is, in addition to being chronically fatigued, you start to get sicker more frequently, and it takes you longer to recover from colds than it used to. So maybe you used to have a robust immune system, but then you've had chronic stress, and that chronic stress has caused long-term elevated cortisol, and now what starts to happen is you get every little cold that comes by. And not only that, it takes you longer to recover from it. And that's because your immune system is suppressed due to the long-term elevated cortisol. High blood pressure. High blood pressure can be stimulated by long-term elevated cortisol, causing a constriction in the blood vessels, causing the heart to contract harder, and blood pressure going up. So high blood pressure is another one. It can affect thyroid function. So depressed thyroid function can be caused by long-term elevated cortisol, because what begins to happen is your thyroid is stimulated by your pituitary gland. So your pituitary gland secretes a hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes to the thyroid, which is a butterfly-shaped gland in the throat area. And we're going to talk about adrenal thyroid-ish connection in another series that I do on thyroid function, so stay tuned for that, where I'll go deeper into the thyroid adrenal connection. But TSH stimulates the thyroid to release a hormone called T4. And T4 goes into the bloodstream and is converted into another hormone called T3. And this is done in the liver and in the kidneys, a little bit in the gut. But T4 gets converted to T3, and T3 is the biologically active thyroid hormone that gives your cells the energy. Like it basically is like that gas pedal for your metabolism. Well, what begins to happen with elevated cortisol is that T4 gets under-converted into T3, so you don't get as much T3 as you need. And not only that, your thyroid gland you start to get what's called thyroid resistance. So you get under-conversion of T4 to T3, you have less T3 for your cells to work with, which means less energy, means slower metabolism, which equals weight gain. And then you also start to get thyroid resistance. So poor thyroid function can be stimulated, or can be caused by, the root cause can be long-term elevated cortisol and adrenal dysfunction. Leptin resistance. Leptin is a hormone that our fat cells secrete when we eat. So when we eat, our fat cells release leptin. Leptin goes up into the brain to the hypothalamus, and it lets us know when we're full and satisfied. Now, long-term elevated cortisol can actually cause the hypothalamus to become resistant to leptin. And that basically means you lose your hunger thermostat. Like, you lose that sense of satiety, that sense of satisfaction, that sense that I'm full and I can stop eating now. And the consequence of that is that you're chronically hungry. Every time you eat, you might feel physically full but unsatisfied, or still craving, or still thinking you need to eat. And that's leptin resistance, and this can lead to weight gain and an inability to lose weight, and the inability to feel satisfied from a meal. Decreased bone mineral density. So we begin to see decreased bone mineral density. So that's leading you towards osteoporosis. So chronic stress and long-term elevated cortisol can lead to osteoporosis, osteopenia, decreased bone mineral density. So the skeletal system is deeply affected by elevated cortisol. Anterior pituitary function, or basically suppression of your anterior pituitary. So the pituitary gland has a front and a back to it, the anterior and the posterior. And the anterior part of the pituitary secretes the hormones that tell your thyroid to function, that tell your adrenals to function, that tell your gonads and your ovaries to function, so the testes and the ovaries. It's involved with life-regulating hormones. It's like such a critical part of our endocrine system, the anterior pituitary. And chronic stress and long-term elevated cortisol can suppress the function of the anterior pituitary gland, which means less TSH to stimulate the thyroid, less ACTH, which stimulates the adrenals to function, less luteinizing hormone, less follicle stimulating hormone, so it begins to affect the female hormonal chain. So as you're starting to see, there's a lot of systems here that are influenced by long-term elevated cortisol. Now, the catch with some of these is that once that is in motion, there's a negative feedback loop or a reinforcing feedback loop that keeps the secretion of cortisol going. One example is this, that when there's the suppression of SIGA, secretory immunoglobulin A, in the gut, and there's a thinning of the lining of the gut, and you get say some leaky gut, when you have that decreased SIGA, that triggers a stress response in your physiology, which feeds back up to the adrenals and tells them to release cortisol. And then the cortisol goes up, and then that feeds back down to the gut, further reducing SIGA, which is a stress response, which feeds back up to the adrenals, stimulating it to release more cortisol. So there's this self-perpetuating cycle that gets initiated with some of these. So we see that also in insulin resistance. Once you start to become insulin resistant, there's a stress response there that stimulates the release of more cortisol. More cortisol leads to more insulin resistance. More insulin resistance leads to more cortisol. Leptin resistance, same thing. Once there's leptin resistance, that stimulates the release of cortisol. The release of cortisol reinforces the leptin resistance. So there's some really intense negative feedback loops there that are happening that you really want to get a handle on. So it's really critical to begin to address adrenal imbalances and to address elevated long-term cortisol. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. In the next video, I'm going to lay out the lifestyle changes and different things you can do to bring your adrenals back into balance, to support them and help basically reduce or minimize the effects of chronic stress and long-term elevated cortisol. You can find me at judahveitel.com. If you want to learn more about what I have to offer and how to work with me, just go to the link below or go to judahveitel.com. And I thank you for watching this video. I hope it's been of benefit to you, and have a nourishing day.